Thank you. And the streaming to the Facebook. Thank you. Good afternoon and welcome to the Philip Roth Personal Library December Book Club. The Philip Roth Personal Library is located at the Newark Public Library in Newark, New Jersey. We are excited to welcome Dr. James Duban, Professor of English and Associate Dean for Research in the Honors College of the University of North Texas. And we are delighted to see all of you this afternoon. My name is Dale Colston, and I'm the Assistant Director for Special Collections here at the Newark Public Library. On behalf of our Director, Christian Zabriskie, and our Board of Trustees President, Dr. Lauren Wells, we thank you all for joining us today. And during this time of uncertainty, we wish for you, your family, and friends to be safe and well. We gratefully acknowledge the Native peoples on whose ancestral homelands we gather. I would like to acknowledge the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Munsee Lenape First Nations on which we are learning, laboring, and organizing today. If you participated in one of our Philip Roth Personal Library virtual book clubs in the past, you may be surprised to see me. Please know that my friend and colleague, Nadine Hiron, is no longer with the Newark Public Library. We miss her dearly and wish her all the best in all of her future endeavors. Some months ago, Nadine circulated Dr. Duban's published article on Roth's Juice or Gravy, along with the first appearance of that narrative some months earlier in the New York Review of Books, prior to its appearance as an afterword in the 20th anniversary edition of Portnoy's Complaint. Nadine also circulated a PDF of the New York Review of Books text that would become the afterword. Both works will be the topic of the day. Dr. Duban will clear all of this up if it doesn't make sense to some of you, I guarantee you. I had a chance to speak with Dr. Duban last week, and this book club will be run a bit differently than others in the past. After Dr. Duban has concluded his presentation, we will allow those of you who would like to speak and be seen on camera. So at Dr. Duban's request, we've disabled the Q&A and chat options for a more favorable, personal, and interactive approach. Dr. Duban and I thank you in advance for your respectfulness, your thoughtfulness, and your kindness toward your fellow participants. Amen? Amen. In case you can't stay with us for the entire program, I want to announce February's book club details. Please join us on Saturday, February 10, when we present Martina Briwa for a dialogue about The Prague Orgy, a 1985 Philip Roth novel. Dr. Briwa's research interests include literary representations of East Central Europe and the construction of selfhood and otherness in multicultural contexts. She has published articles and book chapters on Philip Roth, John Updike, Gary Scheingart. So please be on the lookout for more details soon. Again, that's Saturday, February 10th, 2024. It's almost 2024. Time is flying. So let's welcome today's host. James Duban is a professor of English and Associate Dean for Research in the Honors College of the University of North Texas. His early research addresses American church history and its influence on writers in the American Renaissance. He has published books about Herman Melville and the Henry James family, with articles appearing in a host of journals, including Philip Roth Studies, the Harvard Theological Review, the New England Quarterly, Philosophy and Literature, and Journal of Speculative Philosophy. He has spent the past decade exploring the impact of Sartre, Heidegger, and Arthur Koestler on the fiction of Philip Roth. Please join me in welcoming Dr. James Duban.
Well, thank you so much, Dale. And I'd like to acknowledge, first and foremost, the courtesy that you and Beth and Eric have extended to me over the past several weeks in preparation for this wonderful event, to which I am deeply honored to have been invited. So thank you so much. And I would like to offer a preparatory remark and memorial dedication. In his New York Times essay about the plot against America, Roth, evoking Selden Wishnow, the child of the novel who suffers, quote, something like the European Jewish experience and whose childhood is destroyed by it, references the intersection between the trivial and the tragic, an expression attributable to Arthur Koestler's characterization of the unanticipated clash between routine and existential existence. I personally see this delightful gathering of so many literary enthusiasts as chancing to occur in proximity to the October 7th, 2023 crossroad of the trivial and the tragic, inviting mournful remembrance via what I propose as an interlude of silence. Allow me now to pick up where the book club left off in its last gathering with a 30-minute or so sequence of observations, some off the cuff, others for the sake of brevity, written to speed us toward what I hope will be your alternative readings of Juice or Gravy. This group has already experienced Stephen Sampson's mesmerizing presentation on Portnoy's complaint and its various complexities and achievements. Mine is a more modest undertaking. I deal with the 1994 25th anniversary edition of Portnoy's complaint and Roth's so-called afterword, which Roth previewed in the New York Times Review of Books, 18 September 1994. Still, before examining the text of Juice or Gravy, I'd like briefly to note 10 factors that have gone into my thinking about the possible relations among Poe, Sartre, and Roth in Juice or Gravy, and the pertinence of that array of concern for what I take to be the narrative complexity that counters reductive reader response to Portnoy's complaint that occurred 25 years prior to the novel's anniversary edition. 1, I'd like to read a 2014 email query that I sent to the associate managing editor of Vintage and Anchor Books. I asked, how many of the yellow volumes containing Juice or Gravy did Vintage publish? Was Juice or Gravy dropped from the 1994 printing because it appears to have nothing to do with the novel Portnoy's complaint? Are there vintage records that account for the discontinuation of the 1994 yellow paperback and its continued printing without Juice or Gravy? To this, I received the following response some 8 to 9 days later. Dear Professor Duban, it is not our policy to release printing or sales information, So I'm afraid I cannot help you there. As for the afterword that appeared in the 1994 edition of Portnoy's complaint, it was never intended to be included in the edition in perpetuity, so it was removed some years after publication. That's really all the information we are in a position to provide. I hope that it is helpful. Well, perhaps to a degree. 2, the question arises, why is there no mention of Portnoy's complaint in the afterword to the 25th anniversary edition? One would think that Roth would have taken a few victory laps. 3, the answer, I suggest, may reside in Roth's stated aversion to biographical readings of his works. I say stated because that assumption is called into question by biographies like those of Blake Bailey and Ira Nadel, as well as by the critical insights of Jacques Berlinerblau, all having produced masterful works on Philip Roth, whether through the eyes of biographers or of a stunningly insightful literary critic. 4, for our purposes today, and pertinent to my reading of Juice or Gravy, I'd nonetheless like to emphasize Roth's stated, if questionable, response to unqualified biographical readings. Roth is on record as having scolded, quote, stupid readings of insensate readers whose hunger for stupid little facts demotes literary artistry to the stature of banal newspaper coverage. Elsewhere, Roth remarks, I read fiction to be freed from my own suffocatingly boring and narrow perspectives of life, and to be lured into imaginative sympathy with a fully developed narrative point of view, not my own. It's the same reason I write. As Zuckerman at the end of The Facts says to so-called Roth, your gift is not to personalize your experience, but to personify it, to embody it in the representation of a person who is not yourself. And this scenario, we might recall, is at the basis of a dispute in the next to last segment of Roth's novel Deception, 1990, in which the character Philip's adulterous lover mistakes his notebook entries for personal exposure. She asks, you would change your name to Nathan, would you not, if your work were ever to be published? Would I? Responds Philip. No, it's not Nathan Zuckerman. It's not meant to be Zuckerman. The novel is Zuckerman. The notebook is me, but me imagining. It's the story of an imagination in love. Hence, Roth elsewhere speaks of the personal freedom of imagination that separates readers and writers alike from reality. 5. In accord with these utterances and anticipating a key element of Juice or Gravy, I'd like to return specifically to Portnoy's complaint and the issue of autobiography or unqualified biographical readings. With the exception of the final utterance by Dr. Spielsvogel, Portnoy's complaint strikes me as being an extraordinary dramatic monologue in prose, pitting Portnoy's social conscientiousness against his primal sexuality. This action, as you know, occurs via memory on an analyst's couch during a single session of psychoanalysis. A Jewish young man indignantly bears it all to himself and his analyst with the novel's introductory definition of, quote, Portnoy's complaint as being a disorder which is strongly felt ethical and altruistic impulses are perpetually warring with extreme sexual longings. That definition, of course, pertains to Portnoy's lust and anger versus his position as the Assistant Commissioner of Human Opportunity for the city of New York. Warring impulses indeed. Elements of a dramatic monologue occur in Portnoy's direct address to Dr. Spielvogel. Doctor, do you understand what I was up against? Or, Doctor, do you know baseball at all? Or, surely, Doctor, we can figure this out, two smart Jewish boys like ourselves. And then comes a moment of imaginary dialogue between Portnoy and Spielvogel. Oh, why go on? Portnoy appears to respond to Spielvogel. Why be so obsessed like this? Oh, only let me finish. As if Spielvogel had tried to interrupt him, hence a dramatic monologue. But why equate such writing exclusively and deterministically with Philip Roth, as many commentators did those 25 years earlier? Would, relative to the art form of the dramatic monologue, anybody attribute to Robert Browning the seething resentment and this worldly preoccupations, warring impulses indeed, of the bishop who orders his tomb at St. Praxed's Church? He is similarly caught between an elevated spiritual position and base worldly desires, whether for his former lovers or for lapis lazuli. Or consider the irate indignation of Browning's ostensibly devotional persona in Soliloquy on a Spanish Cloister. There, I might suggest, resides related precedent for the indignation of Alexander Portnoy. Yet, I have nowhere encountered commentary which suggests that Browning was a conflicted Spanish monk. Nor, by the way, have I encountered such comparison in extant literature. If it's out there, mea culpa. Nor should we identify Roth per se with Zuckerman, who in the anatomy lesson masquerades as pornographer Milton Appel, publisher of the girly magazine Lickety Split. And even when, in the facts, Roth claims to be speaking in his own voice, an intrusive Nathan Zuckerman, as we know, eventually highlights the fictive nature of so-called autobiographical self-promotion. 6, which, anticipating our discussion of Juice or Gravy, leads to Roth's outlook on creative freedom. Says Roth, the writer has something beyond self, which is imagination, allowing him to make things up. Roth goes on to remark, you don't necessarily, as a writer, have to abandon your biography completely to engage in an act of impersonation. It may be more intriguing when you don't. You distort it, caricature it, parody it. You torture and subvert it. You exploit it. And you give to the biography that dimension that will excite your verbal life. 7. Applicable to juice or gravy, I have elsewhere argued that such thinking finds partial inspiration in Sartre's being and nothingness, via Sartre's emphasis on ecstatic dimensions that define Dasein, or the being there of consciousness. As developed by Sartre via his challenge to Heidegger's temporal explanation of consciousness in being and time, the ecstatic dimensions mandate the following of consciousness, and I quote, to not be what it is, to be what it is not, and to be what it is not, and to not be what it is, within the unity of perpetual referring. Roth, in turn, in an interview, similarly defined Zuckerman in the anatomy lesson as follows, quote, my hero has to be in a state of vivid transformation or radical displacement. I am not what I am. I am, if anything, what I am not. This reverberation of the Sartrean ecstatic formula is, I take it, parodied in Roth's novel Deception, when we read, quote, our friends had an existentialist nephew of 22 visiting, telling us about why we don't exist, or do. It was a little too much, end quote. 8. Further pertinent to juice or gravy is Roth's aversion to determinism. And here we encounter the response to arguably deterministic Freudian psychoanalysis, in which, for example, everything is reducible to Oedipal or Electra complexes. Such postulates stand opposed to liberating existential psychoanalysis, in which the past exists, but solely to represent what consciousness no longer is, as it flees toward artistic potential and possibility. Now, the arguably deterministic fabric of Freudian psychoanalysis obviously infuses Portnoy's complaint, but that is by artistic design, is it not? Indeed, on the title page of the annotated first edition of Portnoy's complaint, sold at auction to benefit PEN America, and as photographed and published in the New York Times Style magazine, Roth inscribed the following remark. Psychoanalysis provided the vessel for everything: hatred, pettiness, aggression, nonsense, exaggeration, farce, everything allowed in except decorum. Let the repellent in. Yet Roth, in a separate essay in Style magazine, morphs deterministic psychoanalysis into existential freedom. He writes that, quote, the psychoanalytic session provided me with the appropriate vessel to contain everything. I wanted to renounce the orderly, coherent development of an imagined world and to advance helter-skelter in a frenzy as the classic analytical patient ideally proceeds in the throes of associative freedom. Thus, Roth draws freedom out of psychoanalytic determinism, which finally leads to a summary of Juice or Gravy, ever so brief, since you've all received copies of that work. The narrative depicts Roth at a cafeteria where a server asks patrons juice or gravy to top off their slice of roast beef. Roth claims to find a piece of paper with 19 sentences that determined in that very order the creation of the narrative he was destined to write. And here we might recall that the New York Times preview of Juice or Gravy, unlike the afterword in the 25th anniversary edition, contained the subtitle, quote, "How I Met My Fate in a Cafeteria." How I Met My Fate. As for the piece of paper, amidst deterministic references, the haunting nature of that piece of paper evokes, as I have suggested in my essay, Poe's explanation in his philosophy of composition essay of the deterministic way he composed The Raven. Now, Roth, in response, I suggest, to reductively biographical and hence equally deterministic readings of Portnoy's complaint, Juice or Gravy gets drawn into the slimy in itself that Sartre posits as the antagonist of existential freedom, and hence imagination defying determinism and bad faith. All of which contradicts what I take to be early Sartre's consummate respect for the freedom and hence the imagination confirming nature of creative writing. That is, of course, before Sartre's hairpin left turn into Marxist ideology. And at this point, what I'd like to do is stop and hear differing opinions. And it will be a pleasure to live and learn. I published that article some 9 years ago. At this point, I feel rather removed from that time. So please, no hard feelings if people have differing opinions or outright contradictory opinions. I'd really like to hear them and have this all serve as the basis for a great discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Pardon me. I've asked my colleague Beth to allow our guests here to unmute themselves. If you'd like to be on camera, you have that option as well. And now Doctor will take questions, comments, and reactions. Thank you.
James, can you hear me?
I can, Ira.
Oh, great. Okay. Let me start by thanking you. I think it's a great approach. 10 issues with this particular piece and with Roth. I do think, however, we have to acknowledge the contradictions relating to the topic of Roth and biography, because on one hand, he strives to mask any biographical reading of his work from beginning to end, and on the other hand, he interviews a series of people to become his official biographer. And as we know at the beginning of Blake's account, he says, essentially, make my life interesting, okay, as if it wasn't interesting. So I think the whole issue is a very complicated and contradictory one. He has biographers in his fiction, Climate and Exit Ghost, of course. And he, on one hand, resists the impulse to read his work biographically, but on the other hand, encourages people to connect, we'll call it connect, experiences in his work with his actual life. Visiting Israel, he writes Operation Shylock. Okay, I mean, we can go on and on and on. So it's a slippery topic, and I'm not sure anyone can come down definitely in terms of the actual connections, relationships. He's avoiding them, but anyone looking in from the outside, I think, can perceive the importance and relationship. So I guess all I'm saying is beware, because I think he's essentially a joker. And I think a lot of what happens in Juice or Gravy is setting us up in a lot of kind of Kafkaesque way, finding the piece of paper, what the paper contains, and so forth. So I wouldn't read Juice or Gravy too seriously. I think it's a jeu d'esprit. He's, I think, 59 when he delivers the talk in 1994, thinking back a long time ago. So anyway, just a couple of comments about it.
No, and very good comments indeed. And I do concur with you that this is certainly an unsettled topic and can vary with different perspectives on the pertinence of biography to literary interpretation. You yourself have handled that issue masterfully in your biography. Jacques Berliner-Blau writes what I believe he declares to be a reverse autobiography that defines the fiction. And I find, frankly, such arguments compelling. And I'm also reminded that in Being and Nothingness, Sartre himself defines facticity as that part of our past that we simply, and I'm here, of course, paraphrasing, that part of our past that we simply must drag along with us if we're to have moment by moment continuity of consciousness surrounding a centered self. So on either end of that spectrum, I think your remarks are highly pertinent and very much appreciated.
Thank you. Just one little footnote. For an author like Roth to title an autobiographical work The Facts is really asking for trouble, because that's as much work of fiction as it's a gesture towards, the documentary aspect of one's life. And isn't it ironic that at the end of The Plot Against America, he has footnotes. He has all these details to say to the reader, oh, look, I actually based a great deal of what I imagine on these sources. So on one hand, biography can go way too far in over-interpreting an author's life. And I would never say, look, this is the incident and this is the event. But I think it can contextualize the imagination. But Roth is Mr. Imagination. There's no question about it. And I think The Facts is a good illustration of that.
Well, let me ask you in turn a question, Ira. We know from one of Roth's remarks in an interview, I can't remember exactly where at the moment, that he noted, I wish, the interviewer asked something like, you have any regrets about the aftermath of Portnoy's complaint? And I recall his saying, I wish I hadn't taken the criticism so much to heart at the time. And do you feel that his having been assaulted that way really served as the foundation for that complex fabric, often ambiguous, of where biography begins or ends, that he found a well of inspiration in that conflict? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think there's more to it than just that. And I think the issue with Portnoy is as much an attack on his Judaism as it was an attack on masturbation entering the American mainstream literature. And I think you can go back to Defender of the Faith and his response to the attacks on him that occurred when that story was published in the New Yorker. So there's an arc here, and it's beginning. I can't be specific about the beginning, but it's a very long-term issue for him. You know, he said in some exchange with Claire Bloom, something about, aren't we all here, meaning on Earth, to be insulted? To be insulted is to be alive. And you're back to American pastoral, and, you know, getting people wrong is the thing that shows that you're living. He fed on that kind of antagonism. It gave him drive and energy, and I think ignited, to use that verb, his imagination. So I don't think there's anything particular about Portnoy's complaint. He was ready for a fight, and he knew it was happening. And it was happening as he began to read sections to Jason Epstein and a small New York circle before the book was, you know, actually published. But on one hand, he's preparing for that, and on the other, he is depositing very large checks in his bank account, selling the paperback rights, selling the movie rights, and of course, the tremendous advance on the publication of the book. So there's no simple answer.
Great response. Thank you. Other responses from people? Well, while you are deliberating, let me throw in a recap of the an earlier study in which I explored the illustration that appeared in the New York Times book review printing of Juice or Gravy. And I wonder if our host today, if not, that's fine because I can describe it. But is there a screen share of that illustration that might appear for a moment? If not, that's fine.
Sure. Let me see. Beth, would you be able to screen share the illustration from that?
Yep, I'm working on it here.
She's working on it. Thank you. There we have it. Thank you, Beth.
Ah, perfect.
Good.
Perfect.
Very good.
And we'll keep it up there because everybody can still hear me while I'm talking. Now, when I originally chose to chat about this, but decided to offer a more elliptical overview of my thoughts. But when I originally outlined my thoughts, this was point 10. And I confess that I may be wrong in my analysis of Juice or Gravy, as I was 9 years ago when I misconstrued the illustration to the New York Times printing of Juice or Gravy. Created by Lithuanian artist Stasys Grivatajas. The sketch features a handless, legless, cuffed man being led by a footless person whose head stops short of possessing a full cranium. I contacted Stasys via email to learn his intention following his initial reading of Juice or Gravy. I thought he was on to the deterministic fabric of the narrative. Yet, Stasys disclosed that the sketch had absolutely no reference to or bearing on Roth's essay. Rather, The sketch had previously appeared in a separate book that received the 2001 Lithuanian National Book Award. Stasys had, as he told me, given a copy of that book to Stephen Heller, the Times art director, who apparently saw in the sketch the perfect illustration for Roth's story. Heller, whom I contacted, wrote the following to me. I think that I selected this drawing to illustrate the book review piece for two reasons. Stasys was on my mind. What I see before me is what I am interested in for that moment. I always loved Stasys's posters and masks, but had not yet seen his sketches. The simple idea resonated, the man handcuffed to someone or something else. The negation of free movement and thought seemed to fit the initial focus of the writing. At the Times, our illustrations were meant to supplement the texts, to interpret rather than to mimic. This both illustrated Roth and spoke its own message. So, to my mind, Heller's choice of illustration was the first commentary on Roth's afterword, and an apt commentary at that. Stasys, however, had a vastly different interpretation, which I here quote. The drawing represents two people strongly connected. The illustration transcends the page of the paper, transcends the frame. It becomes a symbol, an icon of interhuman relations for life. Well, so much, therefore, for my own preconception of the significance of the sketch. And in that mode of disenchantment and the humility that has to follow from that, I recognize, indeed, the complexity of not only the essay, Juice or Gravy, and the way it can be subject to multiple interpretations, just as in Moby Dick, the doubloon that Ahab pounds into the masthead for the first person who spots Moby Dick, and the sailors walk by and they all have different interpretations. So I recognize that the afterword is so complex as to defy any one reading, just as the whole issue, as Ira has noted, of biography, autobiography, fiction, imagination, is going to be, necessarily has to be, a central point of discussion for decades and centuries to come in Roth's fiction. So what I'd now like to ask is if anybody else, and thank you, I guess we can remove that illustration. Thank you so much. If anybody else has any comments or varied interpretations of either the text of Juice or Gravy or of the illustration to it.
Yes, may I ask?
Please.
Lacking the ability or the energy to go back to the opening lines of each of his of the 19 works that he refers to, what was the relationship of the sentences on that piece of paper to the opening lines of his works? I recognized some, the opening line of Goodbye Columbus, There were a few others in there that jumped out at me, but the bulk of them did not resonate for me as opening lines in his various novels. What was the relationship between what was written on the paper and what Roth claimed in Juice or Gravy to be, his fate to write those books?
I think what you've just asked is perhaps the prelude to a new article on Juice or Gravy. That question is one that I have not yet seen in the literature. As for my own presentation, I have referenced the deterministic, self-consciously deterministic way that Edgar Allan Poe described his creation of the Raven. Of course, Poe beginning by saying that everything begins with the denouement, the ending, and that determines the beginning to the end of it all. Highly deterministic. But those questions that you ask merit new exploration. And I hope that somebody takes up that challenge.
Thank you. It shan't be me.
Why not? Other questions or observations?
An observation. I think we're focusing on the piece of paper, and I kind of focus on the employee of the cafeteria who is doling out juice or gravy. I think that, Roth, as a wise guy, he's sitting there by himself and he's observing this person whose only job it is to say juice or gravy. And he's thinking, on the one hand, how crazy it is that's your job. That's your life work. And then he makes it into something quite magical, which stands for, I think, Roth's belief that random behavior is always going to trump organized, either psychoanalysis or any other human structure. You can try to organize your life as much as you can, and yet trying to predict whether the person is going to say juice or gravy over and over and over again, you'll never be able to predict accurately, 500 juices, 433 gravies, and it becomes a symbol of that randomness, which you could call imagination, but it's also the unpredictability of human events that's throughout Roth's oeuvre.
Roger, I think that's a very insightful observation, and it brings to mind for me Henry James's dictum about encountering experience: dramatize it. And what I take you to be saying is that Roth had the imagination to take three words and to dramatize it into an exquisite work of art via the imagination. And the second thing it brought to mind for me, quite unexpectedly in a presentation about Roth, I once saw an interview that Smokey Robinson of the Miracles gave, and he was talking about his song "Second That Emotion," and he described how he was walking through a department store, and at one counter the clerk was talking to somebody who committed an error in diction when that individual said, "I second instead of saying, I second that motion, she said, I second that emotion. And in his interview, he described how he tucked that away and said to himself, I think I can do something with that. So I think what you've offered is a completely different and wonderful inroad into that essay, because it really exalts the spark of Roth's imagination in dramatizing something that can be so simple, but through transformation and metamorphosis can turn into something so exquisite. That's great. Thank you for that observation. Any others?
Well, yes, I have another thought, if I could jump in again. What if this was subtitled Juice or Gravy, Either or, Either or? And could Kierkegaard be more significant in discussing this piece than Sartre or Heidegger? Isn't he really posing, if we want to become for a second philosophical, this choice that we all face to either maybe remain locked in, as was just suggested, with the trivial, or to use the trivial as a stepping stone for something much broader, much more visionary, more imaginative, and potentially more traumatic. So why can't we read this essay as a choice of either or? And in the end, and correct me, I don't think we really know if he chose juice or gravy. He went for gravy, I think, didn't he? In the essay?
The essay, as I recall, is Juice or Gravy, titled, but it leaves out the subtitle, How
Yes.
I Met My Fate. But
Yes.
I do think that you offer a very cogent suggestion that there are perhaps more philosophical inroads into this and other of Roth's works, that none of them is reducible to a single mode of contemplation or philosophical speculation, which is why I feel that literary scholarship, no one has a monopoly ever, as we know, that all we hope, I think, is that someone in the future will at least wrestle with our interpretation by way of offering a better one. But no, your observation, Ira, strikes me as being contributive and very reasonable indeed.
Well, I don't want to overstate anything, but what I am doing is looking at the Philip Roth Personal Library list of books. And he did have a copy of Either or in his collection. Did he have Heidegger? I am going to tell you in a second. So this is where his books can tell us something quite helpful in terms of the outlook, the reading, the background, that sort of thing. Now, just give me a second here. I can tell you other authors with the letter H, but I haven't. Here we go. Here we go. I don't think so. It doesn't appear that he owned a copy of Heidegger.
No, you're correct about that, Ira. What he did own was Kaufman's collection on existential writing that includes commentary on Heidegger. But we also recall, as you know, in The Ghostwriter, Heidegger is on the shelf of Leonov. So he covers Heidegger there. And then, as you know, from the bibliography at the Newark Public Library, the Roth collection, he owned about 10 of Roth's works, of Sartre's works. Now,
Yes.
among those is not Being and Nothingness, but the others contain several times articulations of I must not be what I am, and I am what I must not be, and so on and so forth. Nor did he own a copy of Sartre's Why Write, as you know, the title of his collected short fiction. Yet that volume seems to have influenced his Sartre in a volume, What is Literature, that contains his essay, Pourquoi écrire, Why Write, seems to have. So the whole question is so complex. We're so gifted to have those thousands of volumes that he bequeathed, and the richness of the scholarship that's going to emerge from those for hundreds of years is just enormous. When we think that Melville's family gave away most of the volumes he owned, and then somebody like Merton Seeltz came along and had to piece together the remnants, either from the Houghton Library or private collections and so on. Recently, Alan Gribben has completed his 50-year detective-like study of the editions of different books owned by or mentioned by Mark Twain and so on. So all of those books, for me, at once are remarkable in terms of the gift they comprise for literary scholars and biographers, and at the same time, the questions they raise. As we know, Roth consulted so many libraries in his life, including the Newark Public Library and University of Chicago Library, and was just, as we know, a constant and avid reader. So it just opens up more and more possibilities that I think will continue to fuel Roth studies well into the future.
I have one quick exact question for you, and you've done such great research on the illustration and the art editor at the New York Times. Who decided to include Roth's essay as the afterword to the 25th anniversary edition? And was that, I'd love to see an exchange of correspondence. Do you know anything about that?
All I have is my deduction. And what I would propose is this. As you know, at the very end of the New York Times printing of Juice or Gravy, we have a notice that this is due to appear as the afterword, right? So my thinking has been, I cannot say whether the publishers decided that this would be a fit afterward. What we know is that, and I believe it was something like 4 to 6 months earlier when he wrote the New York Times printing of Juice or Gravy, that Roth himself at that point was determined, either by his own choice or the suggestion of a publisher, that be the afterword. I'm more inclined to think that he was working something out, previewing it in the New York Times Review of Books, but convinced at the time that this would be an appropriate afterword for at least some of the reasons that we've speculated about. But I cannot say with any sense of definitiveness that that's the case, just as much as I couldn't deduce with any certitude the pertinence of Stasis's illustration for the story, and then was shocked to learn that it never had any bearing on the story.
Roth, of course, was a very determined author and very keen to celebrate himself from the very beginning. You may know he wrote draft advertisements for Goodbye Columbus, which he passed on to Houghton Mifflin and George Starbuck, saying, this is how it should be done. And so I think there's an element of calculation with Roth and his decision, and I believe it would be his decision to include this piece as the afterword, precisely because it does not mention Portnoy's complaint.
Ah, there you have it. There you have it. No, that's great. That's great. Any other comments? Any other comments? Well, in view of that, what I'd like to do is simply to thank this group for having taken its valuable time on a Saturday to be here. I'd like to thank you for the generosity you displayed in sharing opinions. I'd like to reiterate my thanks to Dale, Eric, and Beth. They worked very hard to accommodate the electronics that I had in mind for this presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And just to say, I've had a grand old time at the opera this morning, and I hope that others have as well.
Thank you, Dr. Duban. Thank you, everyone, for joining us here at the Newark Public Library's Philip Roth Personal Library. If you are ever in Newark, New Jersey, please stop by. Let us know you're coming in advance, and we'll be more than happy to see you, give you a tour, and let you sit in this space that he set aside for the people of Newark. And we thank you all for your continued support. If you can, please join us February 10, 2024 for dialogue with Dr. Martina Briwa about the Prague Orgy, a 1985 Philip Roth novel. Again, during these times of uncertainty, we wish that you, your family, and friends are well. Thank you. Good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.